Welcome to LLP, the Lawyer Life podcast, where the personal, professional, and political intersect. Each week, we cover a topic to help ourselves and other lawyers navigate our days with a little less stress and ideally a lot more fulfillment. On today's episode, we talk burnout. In roundtable format, we analyze Anne Helen Peterson's article, How Millennials Became the Burnout Generation. I'm Mike Anderson.
And I'm Darlene Tonelli.
Little delay there, Darlene. Slow to the whatever draw this morning.
That's how this is going to be. There's just going to be a slight delay and a little bit of extra slow thinking.
No, it must be because you're not a millennial like me. I'm quick.
Based on our discussion, I'm supposed to be the non-burnt out one in this equation, but
that's
I don't know.
True.
I'm going to challenge that and demonstrate that that is not. Millennials have no monopoly on this concept. But anyway, yeah.
So we are today going to talk about. So this was a Buzzfeed news article by Anne Helen Peterson entitled "How Millennials Became the Burnout Generation." It's got a ton of buzz, so the Buzzfeed people must be excited. But it's provoked a lot of conversation, and we think it's actually not only applicable for lawyers generally, especially some of the younger folks practicing. And with that, we are bringing on one of those, early on in their career folks, Rosel Kim, who I will actually bring on to the conversation in a second. But before I do that, an introduction. So she is the in-house counsel at a fintech company, practiced for 2 years on Bay Street. She writes lifestyle and advice columns for Precedent Magazine, a publication we all know and love, written on issues such as being racialized on Bay Street, the importance of statements of privilege, things in that space. And she's been well recognized for her leadership and community involvement with diversity initiatives by being selected as a Civic Action Diversity Fellow in 2017. And that's a leadership program for emerging diverse leaders in the GTA region. So without further ado, Rosel, how's it going?
Good morning. I'm doing well, thanks. Not too burnt out today.
No?
Not yet. Anyways.
She was much faster on the draw.
I only checked Instagram once when I woke up, so maybe that's why.
I'm on it right now, monitoring my brand.
We all read this article as sort of a tour de force of explaining some of the things that most people in this generation can relate to. But also, I would say as the one of the dynamics on this podcast is that I'm not a millennial, and I guess I'm technically Gen X. But when I read this article, I also saw just some things that I think are plaguing the world and all generations too. So I would just say that I agree with all of those. Those were the top points in the article. And I think that there's going to be a lot more said about this article because there's already been some really good response to it in Slate and in The Guardian. And I mean, it's fair to say it went viral even by any standard. This is a very, very well circulated article. So when we decided to talk about it on this article or on this podcast today, we really each came to it with an interesting perspective of our own. So I'm potentially going to bring the older generation perspective to it, even though I've got some millennial leanings for sure. Mike, what was your big takeaway from the article?
Well, I think, to kick it off, it starts with this idea of errand paralysis, and I haven't heard that phrase before, and it grabbed me immediately. And why is it that these tiny tasks, which are annoying, certainly, but not impossible, why are those remaining on my list, just like they do, it sounds like, for a lot of folks? And then as you get going, you start to see these structural reasons why we are burnt out, exhausted, tired, and can't keep up seemingly with the expectations we have for ourselves or the expectations that are placed upon us for economic and other reasons. So for me, it was cathartic. It was reading it let me know that the experience that I'm having is not necessarily unique, and then outlining why I'm feeling that way and seeing it all on the screen in this instance was really helpful. And then ultimately the question is, what do we do? And I know we'll get to that at the end. So I was curious because I have some examples of errand paralysis, but do either of you have errand paralysis examples in your life?
Oh my gosh. Rosel, perhaps you should start so that I don't take up the whole podcast.
Well, it's funny. So one of the examples in the article, Peterson talks about this woman who's had something to mail that's been sitting in her room, and there's literally been something that I've been meaning to send to someone since December. Like, I meant to send it as a Christmas present, and I'm ashamed to say it's still sitting in my living room, and I just
Perhaps
can't seem to bring
a
myself.
Valentine's present.
Yeah, maybe at this point it might be better suited for that. I was going to say Happy New Year present. Like, on Christmas Day, I said I'll send it as a Happy New Year gift, but it's now January, so just getting pushed and pushed even further.
Right.
I bet you thousands of people who read that article looked at a package or something sitting in their living room or kitchen as they were reading this article that needed to be dealt with.
Yeah.
I read a different article this morning that called it Death by Minutia To-Do List. And I thought that's a really good way to explain it too. And, consistent with what we're talking about today, because her example, which people will laugh at, but she was trying to save time by having a food delivery service, one of those meal kits. And so her point was it kind of saves time in that you don't have to do groceries and things like that. And people nowadays are always looking to save time, and arguably millennials in particular. And she basically said that it becomes a to-do to manage the scheduling and the cancellations of this meal kit, which adds a half an hour here. And what occurred to me was just nothing has changed about things take time.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, when I have errand paralysis, this is the mental calculus. And I think lawyers will relate to this. And you guys can tell me how millennials relate to it. But when I think about going to the dry cleaner, which is my big issue, cannot make it there, I just sort of calculate, like, what is it worth to me to go to the dry cleaner? What is it going to take away from, what is it going to add to my life? And that's what I related to in the article, because she basically says there's no payoff to these tasks. And when you operate in a world where you're sort of virtually working or trying to be available to family or other more important values, maybe it's not that important to do the stuff on the to-do list. That's kind of what I came to. Like, I don't get to it immediately because it's not that important.
Yeah, or it's often the thing that you need to do for yourself, and as opposed to something that other people are expecting you to do. Like, I know certainly I get done, and this applies professionally and personally otherwise. I get done the stuff that other people expect me to get done. The stuff that I'm on my errand paralysis list is the stuff that really is just for me, because I'm the only one affected. The other thing as well that I think about errand paralysis is that, like, the way that we interact with things now causes us so to have to engage in so many small, annoying tasks. And like, for example, there's a great comedian who did a bit about like how we're all of our own tech service now. Like, when something goes wrong with our phone or an app or something on our computer, that becomes our burden to fix it. And so it just feels like certainly technology, new evolutions are helpful, but also it was way easier 30, 40 years ago. You had a book, you had a phone, and you had a pen, and that's that those were the things that you interacted with at work and generally otherwise, and a printed newspaper. And isn't that great? And now it's like, the iPad, I want to get the news in the morning, but so I'll have to have that charged up. And also, my daughter wants to, we're going to have to play something for in the card, and so I download something on there, and then the Wi-Fi is not working, and so I have to go fix the Wi-Fi. But now actually it's the router's outdated, so I have to go get a new router. But that means I have to change the passwords on every single one of my Apple TV things and everybody's phone, and then the guests, I'll have to put.
Oh my God, Mike, you sound so burned out.
And that's just an iPad and getting news on it, and I just feel like we're servicing so many things in our lives that it ultimately then the question is, do I even need to read the news? No. And then, then you feel bad about yourself and blah, 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 spiral. Too much?
No, it's perfect. It's funny because I've had a recent experience of the clash of generations on this point, because when I was on maternity leave, my mom came to stay with me, and she, when I was a kid, was a stay-at-home mom.
Yeah, so something that struck me in the article was how gender plays into this idea of a burnout too. And Peterson sort of talks about women being the manager of their households for most part. And that leads to an increased mental load, that leads to more burnout. And something that struck me in the article was her citing a statistic that said that women who work still spend just as much time taking care of their children as stay-at-home mothers did in 1975. And
Right.
like you said, Darlene, like time is, becoming ever more scarce for women. And I don't have children, so I don't have personal experience with that, but I've certainly seen people that I work with deal with sort of trying to manage, the school shots and making sure everybody was fed and dressed and going to school, like all the different deadlines and tasks that they had to take care of, and everybody in their household on top of themselves. And just thinking about it makes me feel tired, because sometimes when I make a lunch for myself, that's like a really good day for me. So I guess that really makes me sound like a millennial of like, can't do a simple errand of feeding myself,
But I don't know that it is, because I think when I read that article, I think millennials are just forced to make a and I think we should asterisk. Mike will require this, and we try not to generally paint millennials with one brush, and that's why I've been kind of cautious to say that I feel sometimes a bit millennial, even though I'm from before the millennial generation, because of just the pace of life in the lifestyle that I've chosen, and the fluidity of it. But not everyone is the same, obviously, in this camp, and there may be people from this generation who don't at all relate to this article, but hopefully people can take that into account when we're speaking about it. But I definitely think that the whole millennial experience painted here is just they're forced to make calculations about how to spend their time in a way that previous generations have not been. They haven't had the breadth of things. I think almost option paralysis too, right? Like that's what I
Yes.
kind of took
yeah.
from this article. Like it's full free will now. You can be, I mean, with an asterisk, obviously. And Rosel, you should definitely speak to this, because there's more to say. But the idea is, in theory, there's more opportunity than ever for career advancement. It's not only men who work, for example. There are all these different careers. It's not, when you go to the guidance counselor, hopefully they're not still just telling you about the 4 or 5 careers that most people do. There's just so much to choose from. And that's its own tough thing. Great, but tough.
Yeah, and I think it really contributes to this idea of like a race to the bottom, because as I briefly mentioned before, this idea of like the gig economy that we have, and jobs are more scarce, and even in the legal field, which is like a fairly privileged field, we have a articling problem. And also, what might be unique to our generation is that there's this idea that your job should not only be well compensated and stable, but it should also be fulfilling. Like you should love what you do. And that's part of the option paralysis as well, that you always think there might be something better for you out there, and you're always searching and striving, that things that you're doing doesn't seem to be good enough. Like you're filling a jar that has a hole in the bottom, and that you keep trying to fill it, but it just never gets full in the way that you think it should be full.
I think that's such a good analogy, the jar that you keep putting into, and it just goes out the bottom and doesn't ever get more full. What about, here's a thought that I had after listening to you guys talk about this. Is it that, so one of the things that both of you, I think, went through generationally is that you came up through school at a time when the messaging that you received from parents and educational institutions, it was, you must excel at everything or you will never get a job. But what I'm interested in is, is it true that, like, is that a true statement that you have to be a super overachiever, or is it just a feeling that everybody has?
What's happening, I think, with our generation is that many people were brought up with that, like, to get to the top of all of these type A, really, involved people, you have to do more. To get a job in that environment, you have to do more. We're seeing that it's really hard to be at the top of something, and necessarily when you get there, you don't get the payoff that society effectively promised you at some point.
So that's so interesting because Rosel, can you talk to the point about the fact that this idea that you work hard and there's a payoff?
Mhm.
Is that true too? Is that true for everybody?
Um,
Generationally, like in our parents' generation, was it true for everyone that you could work hard and you would be on easy street?
I mean, I think that's definitely uh, the mainstream idea of what baby boomers got. That they got housing security and they got retirement benefits. But I think one pushback that I read, which I thought was interesting, was that there weren't really baby boomers in certain groups. Like if you were a racialized person or if your parents were immigrants, then I think you didn't really get to enjoy those things. And one of the narratives that I read, there was a follow up piece to the Burnout article where Buzzfeed collected sort of responses from 16 different people who identified as millennial, and they asked them to write a reflection. And I just wanted to read one of them where this woman said, "As a Black woman, I feel as though I was born tired. Every woman in my family has always worked since adolescence until the day they died." That's the one thing I think is always missing from conversation about women in the workplace. To middle-class white women, work still seems somewhat of a novelty. I'm an elementary school teacher. My mother was a social worker. My grandmother was a teacher, and her mother was a slave. I was born burnt out. So that to me sort of, signals that maybe this idea of like the generational divide is only accessible or only applicable to certain groups, certain racial groups, but also certain geographical. It depends on your geographical location as well. And in order to be burnt out, you need to have come from a place where you weren't burnt out before, right? So that alone, like framing this as a burnout, might also signal the fact that people who feel burnt out have certain kind of privilege that other people are just trying to survive.
Well, I think that's such an important point because when you mentioned it, for me, it opened up a real, I feel like a lot of people are talking about this issue, but there's not a lot of real clarity on how to solve it. Like, where do we go from here? Right. And when you mentioned that point, I thought, the truth is that in my parents' generation, it was still true that there were certain groups that had no access to the benefits of the capitalist system, right? Like, not to sound like too much of a Marxist or something. I'm not just mentioning capitalism, like the idea that if you work hard, you make more money. Let's boil it down to that. And what I'm realizing with the millennial generation, and people even younger than millennials, I guess, is I think that just the access to the real benefits of that system have actually shrunken over time, right? It's actually fewer people who can, like, yes, women can access it more. Yes, there has been some progress on access to top jobs and things like that for people who are racialized or came from first generation immigrant parent families. But there's a lot of room to move. But there are a lot of people who thought they would have access to the system who don't. And I think that that is a major social problem. And when I read that article, I thought, this is a political platform because there are real issues in here. It's not the people. It's not, and she does make this point in her article. She says, we as millennials feel like it's our fault, like we're not doing enough yoga. We're not going inside. We're not like finding our passion. I don't think that's it. I think it's part of it. I think that the opportunity is millennials don't accept the same things that parents did, right? So Michelle Obama talks in her book Becoming about how when she got her big fancy law firm job in DC, I think it was, she was totally miserable. And her mom was like, "Why do you think that your misery matters? Like, you have a great gig here. You have money, you have a nice car. What more do you need?" And sort of blankly looking at her, right? And I think it's a good thing to want to value your day and your time. That's a good thing. But it's not good if you can't make a living at it. So I almost feel like there's a mismatch between where the world is and what they're telling everybody and where, you know, the payoff is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I also wonder whether medium like Instagram and how the way that we understand the world has become so much more visual kind of relates to this feeling of a burnout. Because I think what it does is like it condenses uh, complicated narratives into just like very glossy shots, or you just kind of perceive stories as nicely curated photos or short clips that you watch. And I've sometimes wonder about what effect that has on my own brain too, where the process, a lot of the process of trying to get somewhere that like is lost, or we don't often see the struggling or the time that we spend sort of being lost and trying to get to where we want to go. And all you see is the result, or like all you see is like the picture of success, and you don't really know the backstory. Or even if you know that the shot is curated and photoshopped, I think it still has an effect of why am I not there, or why doesn't my life look like that every day. So I think that there's like a disparity, or this distinction between what's real and what's not, and also just this like hyper visualized representation of our lives doesn't really help to understand the structural issues that are much, much deeper.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what's interesting is you've these structural issues that make quote unquote success kind of an impossibility. But you see the success online in these pictures. And so your house has to look like an Instagram dollhouse everywhere because you see everybody's places and you have to have cool vacations and blah blah blah.
And do the best workouts.
Yeah.
And do the best workouts. Yes, be in perfect physical form. Well, I think it ties nicely, and we'll wrap it up with this kind of tying it back to the mission of the Lawyer Life podcast, because I think that the reason I'm so interested in trying to figure out the solution to this problem is just that what we're trying to do is help lawyers, navigate their day with a little less stress and more fulfillment. And what I've observed so far is that most of my stress comes from not having something that I either think I should have or that I feel is necessary to a happy life based on some form of advertising that I've received, whether that advertising came from a corporation in a real ad, or a friend's house, like you said, Mike, that is really next level. And I think that where I've come to, partially just because of it's almost like the reverse. It's like I've chosen the path that I want to be on in life, and it comes with certain realities. In that, I haven't prioritized the making of income to the expense of my personal health and well-being, and accordingly, lifestyle shrinks a little bit. And not, I'm privileged in the fact that I was able to buy a house in Toronto before things became crazy and stuff like that. So, with a little bit of a caveat, I don't know what the current path to that is, but I know that for me, it started with the thinking process, and it started with a rejection of um, really the glamour of it. I don't know, maybe it was working at a record label and sort of coming up close with glamour that I had only seen from afar before. And so I don't know that it's like everyone's experience is going to be different, but I think that what I see and what I hear from what you guys are saying is you've got perfect information. And the point that we're always trying to make is now we need wisdom. This is the Google generation, this is the Instagram generation. And so we can't just passively accept what we're fed, whether it's by a friend or by an advertiser, without saying, well, what does this mean for me? Does this mean I need to uh, go be a partner at a firm to make sure my house looks like this? I don't know. To me, it's like it's the connections. So anyway, I really thank you guys for sharing this, and we may have to have another episode on the issue of burnout specifically. This might be might need a follow up.
We could do a whole series on this. I feel there's a ton here, but I think that your point is well taken, Darlene, and we'll add it to our laundry list of things to do. We'll look introspectively figure out our life's values and goals, and then reshape our entire life to do so. It sounds, and I say that in jest, like it sounds near impossible, but that's the point of especially your blog series and a lot of the things that we cover here today is that on the podcast generally is that it is possible to get out of this spiral down, and as Mark Sakamoto said last week, it's really easy when you're spiraling down to continue to spiral down, and when you're spiraling up to continue to spiral up. And what, if people feel like they're spiraling downward, then it's important to take a step back and reset and see why that is and try to eliminate the stuff that's causing you to move that way.
Sounds good.
The Lawyer Life Podcast is brought to you by Inter Alia Law, experienced legal counsel when and where you need us. To learn more about Inter Alia, visit the website at spelled INTERALIA-law.com. Thank you. And we are back to talk about our goods. Goods are things we want to support. And thanks to Mark Sakamoto's advice last week, we will no longer gripe, even though some of today's episode was lots of griping, mostly by me. Okay, so Rosel, is there anything that you would like to qualify as good and support on this podcast?
For sure. So my first book of 2019 was a book called I'm Afraid of Men by Vivek Shraya, who's a Calgary-based artist. And it's hard to describe what the book was, but I would say it's sort of blurring the genres of memoir, gender theory, and manifesto on exploring, what toxic masculinity means, which is a topic that's been on the media lately. And Shreya sort of explores it by talking about her childhood as a brown queer teenager who didn't really fit in, and then coming out as trans, and the treatment that she received and the threats that she's felt, and how we can work towards sort of breaking down these gender stereotypes. And I found it really moving, really personal, and really touching, and sometimes really funny as well. So highly recommend. It's only 50 pages or so. So it's a quick read and a good read.
That's great. Your good in some ways dovetails with mine, and my good was new perspectives and acknowledging your blind spots. And there's a Globe and Mail article that came out so January 8th by Andrew Clark entitled "Why Some Women Fear the Self-Service Gas Station." This all was from a Twitter conversation from one man whose partner, a female, would always bring the car back with an empty tank, and it was a problem in their relationship and caused arguments until one day she told him why. And I had no idea about the kind of regular instances of verbal abuse, harassment that women incur at gas stations. And reading a book like that for us gentlemen would be great because we can start to understand where we have blind spots.
Totally. My good is a little bit less substantial, which is interesting because normally I have the concern for the future of the world, good and gripe. But I just want to say good for Lady Gaga music. I really like that she's got this The Star is Born movie. And the one thing that we have a group of our law school friends are going to do a movie night this week. So we were looking up all the different movies. And it's fair to say that as most of us are fairly new parents, we don't get out to movies really ever. So it was a little bit of a novelty. And I was looking at Star is Born and looking at this great musical, listening to the music. And I am hoping to go see A Star is Born if I can find it in the theaters still. But that's what I was thinking. It's a good. She makes some good music and is doing always interesting things and being her own authentic self most of the time.
Great. Okay. So Rosel, thank you so much for joining us. It was our first roundtable discussion, and you're so wonderful to give us your time. And so thank you.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay. That does it for this week. I guess we will talk soon. That's it for this week's episode of LLP. Thanks to Inter Alia Law for presenting the podcast and to Nick Fowler for composing and performing our music. See our show notes for his website. Don't forget, we love feedback. Please comment in the review section or subscribe or like. We'd appreciate it greatly. That's it. Talk soon.